If you clicked on this video, you're probably wondering what type of title is that? And I'm going to explain it, and I'm going to try and walk my way out of it in a logical sense so that you guys understand why I think China and Chinese people need to listen to the United States and also people from the United States. And that's kind of a bold statement, but I'm going to explain why I'm even talking about that, because in my last video, I said that the United States often blames China for all the problems, which is true, and I gave examples of the housing crisis, and I gave examples, a few tweets about the most recent conflict happening. And what I saw, which is a little concerning, was many people, specifically Chinese viewers, came into the comments and they were saying, we don't care about the United States anymore. They're always lying. It doesn't matter what they say. We are going to do our own thing and China's going to build. And we're basically going to block the haters. And I agree with that on the surface. But the problem with that mentality is if Chinese people and the Chinese government disengage culturally and essentially disengage from people-to-people communication, and if they disengage from the Western world and say, you know what, the Western media is always bashing us, the Western politicians always come to China and tell us how we should act. You have all these senators and you have all these politicians coming from the United States and they always lecture China, and Chinese officials are very gracious and they nod their head and they say, yes, thank you, we'll do better. And then they say, goodbye, hope you had a good trip. And then they don't change, which is extremely funny to me, because it's the Chinese hospitality of, well, if you're going to come here, we're going to show you a good time, a respectful time. We're going to be respectful to your demands, so to say. But we aren't going to change. And I think this whole idea of we won't change, and because the United States have been coming to China for years and years and years telling us how we should behave and how we should run our government and how we should run our economy and how we should manage our people, a lot of people have gotten tired of it with good reason, because when they look out and they see that the Chinese society has improved a lot, they say we're doing fine. We don't need the American way, especially when they look to America and there's many problems. I've mentioned this many times, from homelessness to drugs to just disingenuous politicians, people who are always at each other's throats, and it just doesn't seem like anything gets done. But the issue that I'm talking about, and why I think Chinese people and why the Chinese government should listen to the United States, is because we don't live in a vacuum. The United States is going to continue to push China to change to the point of, in my opinion, war. And so if the Chinese people and the Chinese government don't attempt to persuade regular Americans and to persuade future politicians that China is not a bad country, that it's a normal country, and also to show American people and American politicians that China has progressed and is continuing to progress. It may not be progressing in the same way that the United States has progressed, or it may not be perfectly in line with what the United States wants, but that's okay. It doesn't mean that they're adversaries. And I think we need to spread that message. And when I say we, I mean there's a lot of people like myself who try and talk about this, but we need Chinese voices also. Chinese people who are willing to engage and not disengage. Because what I was seeing in the last video was a lot of comments basically saying, what's the point? And I have a personal antidote, or a personal story, as my camera shakes because my cat is about to jump up. Oh, sports. Yep. So I have a personal story about this. When I started working for a media company in 2016, there was already this... My cat just threw something on the floor. There was already this kind of feeling that the United States is a hopeless cause. And what I mean by that, I was the marketing manager and we made content about China. And my opinion was the content wasn't very interesting, and it wasn't very good for an American audience. And I said, Americans aren't going to find this interesting. And I told my boss this, and my boss essentially said, we don't care about America. And I said, what do you mean you don't care about America? And they said, well, the Americans won't be influenced by what we say because they have so much propaganda already. They have so much media saying China's bad that it's almost impossible for us to make any headway. And so we would rather focus on the global south. So we would rather focus on countries in Africa and South America where we actually can have some influence. And I said, that makes sense. But at the same time, the Western world still holds a lot of the power. And by power, I mean military power and economic power. And so when you disengage from that discord, and when you say, whatever, you guys are illogical and you're never going to understand China, so we aren't going to focus on you, then they continue to spread those lies, and there's no counterbalance. And when there's no counterbalance, basically they will rally up all their support and the mob will come after China. It's very easy for, this mob mentality. If people in the United States and in other Western countries are told their entire life that China is bad, and there's no counter voice to say, actually, no, China's pretty much a normal country like anywhere else. You may have heard bad things about the Chinese government, or you may have heard crazy stories about the Chinese people, but you can flip that around about any government. There's crazy stories about the United States government. There's crazy stories about the French government, or the Canadian, or the Australian, right? Every country has good and bad. And I think that's the message we need to be spreading, is that China is a normal country. And so the mob doesn't need to get riled up, and it doesn't need to come after China because the United States is putting out this information. And so it really is disheartening when I see comments that are basically saying whatever. Because at the end of the day, if a conflict happens, it's not just Chinese people that are going to suffer. It's going to also be my countrymen who end up, if conflict happens, if they end up over here in Asia, it's going to be my people, it's going to be your people, it's going to be everyone globally. Like I was saying in the last video, if a conflict was to break out, nobody benefits from that. So when somebody says, I don't want to engage anymore with the Americans because they are illogical or they won't accept my story. Even myself on this channel, I make these videos and I get to the point where I'm sometimes like, I don't even want to put this content out because what's the point? Who's going to listen? But I have to keep going, and I have to keep going, and you guys have to keep going and spread the message that China is normal, in that every country has its good and bad, and if we can come together and talk about the good and talk about the bad, maybe we can come to a middle ground to where there isn't a need for aggression. There isn't a need for all the hate. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, we want to spread positivity. We want to spread, inclusiveness. We don't want to spread hate. We don't want to create problems. And if we can get that message out, and if enough of us say, hey, and this is on both sides, Americans and Chinese people, if enough people have friendships and enough people say, no, I know an American and he's normal, or I know a Chinese person and that person is a normal person, they don't want conflict, because at the end of the day, none of us really want conflict. And if we can spread that message of peace and say, hey, this doesn't need to happen, and I know an American, I can talk to him, or I know a Chinese person, I can talk to him, then maybe if enough of us push that message, we might be able to make some impact. Because many people who might watch me, or any of these other ones who are talking positively about China, or even somebody you might end up in a comment section commenting with, if you're respectful and you explain why China is the way it is and why it's good or bad in a respectful manner, that person might grow up and be a senator or might be a politician here in China. So I think that's why we need to remember that people can make a difference, and we shouldn't give up on each other just because we're tired and just because it feels like no progress is being made. And speaking of progress, we just passed the 70K mark. We have 70,000 subscribers here, which is mind-blowing. So if you're one of the people that want to spread peace, hit the like button so that more people can hear this and more people can maybe engage. Leave a comment. If you're for peace, say something like, China and America should be friends. Because I think ultimately when we work together, we can overcome most of our problems. And right now, there seems to be a disconnect, at least from, essentially from both sides, a disconnect in people saying we don't want to work anymore. Economically, maybe, but everything else, let's not even have communications. And that's where when the communication breaks down, that's when things get real bad. So I'm hoping to see more comments of positivity, especially from Chinese people who happen to watch my content, who say, no, I haven't given up on America. And I hope that the Americans or Canadians or wherever else, when you guys come in, you're willing to also spread positivity and say, we can solve any problems that are being created by our governments by being more open with each other and by creating relationships that are beyond superficial or beyond trolling each other online, calling each other stupid or idiots or whatever. So if you want that message to get out, give this video a like. Thank you for being here, all 70,000 of you, and I will see you in the next video.